Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the second episode of the Primary Science Podcast. So today, the main focus is on bridging that gap between primary and secondary education in science. So we'll be talking about everything from curriculum, common misconceptions, even to skills development. And to help us do this, everyone, I'm very, very proud to welcome our second guest on the show, Alex. So Alex is the secondary head of science at St Andrews International School in Bangkok, Thailand. And he's also the owner of the popular YouTube channel Science Source. So I've linked that in the description. Please make sure you go and have a look. Before we dive in though, I'd really just love to welcome you all to go and leave a comment with your views about today's topic and what you'd be interested to hear me discuss on the next episode as well. So let's get into it and go and meet Alex. Okay, Alex, a massive welcome to the show. How's it going?
It's going well. Been a very busy day, but glad to be here.
Good, very nice to hear. So you were kind of introduced to me as a bit of a science guru of sorts because you've got this successful online following as well as plenty of experience with teaching and leading science at secondary schools. So we're super excited to have you. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and about your journey into teaching science and leading science.
Okay. Well, it started with, I think, a desire to travel. And I kind of had this idea that maybe I would go into teaching English as a foreign language. Took a gap year at university and I was a volunteer teacher in Vanuatu, a little tiny island nation in the South Pacific. I did 6 months of that, realized that I do quite enjoy this teaching thing, but I had no intention of doing it as a secondary school thing. And then when I finished university, I got my CELTA and went teaching English in Shanghai. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that I think teaching really is my vocation, but that actually it's my degree area, science, is actually what I want to be doing. And so that I sort of made that logical change. I did my PGCE I did it while I was in Shanghai as an online learning thing. Then it went from there. So I went from Shanghai to Mauritius and then to Bahrain, and now I'm in Thailand.
Wow, you're actually very well traveled. That's really, really good, like a nomadic teacher in a way. Are you thinking of maybe moving on to the next place soon, or do you think you found your roots here in Thailand?
Cracked it here with Thailand.
Nice, yeah.
I've done the quiet island thing a couple of times. I've done the busy city thing. I think there's just something about a place like Bangkok. It's like Marmite. It works for some. Some people really don't like it. It just clicks for me and my family. It just works.
Yeah,
really works.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I have to agree with that. Okay, so it's now time for the Quick Fire 5 segment of the show. So that's 5 questions in 5 minutes to help us get to know you a bit better. Are you feeling ready for it?
I'm ready.
Nice.
Feeling the pressure, but I'm ready.
The pressure's on. Okay, so question 1. Who inspires you the most in the world of science as a whole and why?
I think the first name that comes to mind is James Lovelock. He was the creator of the Gaia hypothesis. I think he just inspires me because it's a very unique idea. He's looked at it from every imaginable angle, looked at all sorts of, it's a very broad spectrum area of science. And I just find it very unique, very original ways of thinking. And so I think he's the biggest inspiration.
Lovely. Good answer. So question 2, what is your favorite, like all-time favorite experiment, science experiment, and why?
Okay, first, number 1 experiment would be putting an aquatic plant in hydrogen carbonate indicator. And it's going to sound so dull to anyone that's not interested in science education. But you put it in, and hydrogen carbonate indicator changes color depending on the concentration of carbon dioxide. And so it shows that the level of carbon dioxide will drop in the daylight, and it'll change color to reflect that because the plant's taking it in. And then overnight, it will release carbon dioxide as respiration overtakes photosynthesis. And so if you come in back to your classroom first thing in the morning, you'll see that it's kind of yellowy colored water, and then within the next hour or two of daylight, it'll start to turn purple again. And it just shows that both photosynthesis and respiration are both happening, and everyone
Mm.
loves a good color change experiment. And
Yeah,
I'm
it's
not
very
sure if I
visual.
kept that to a minute or not, but
No, it's okay. It's okay. We can go quicker on some questions.
okay.
Um, so, question 3: if you could only teach one science topic or unit for the whole year, what would it be and why?
Inheritance. I
Okay.
I really, really struggle to say why. It's just the topic that I like the most. I think the bit I like the most about it is the kind of problem solving aspect of it. You've got this pattern of characteristics in the grandparents and this pattern of characteristics on this side of the family, trying to predict what would the offspring, what traits would they have, that sort of thing. And I just really enjoy that sort of stuff. I like genetics in general, but it's the
Nice.
inheritance patterns that I find the most interesting.
I guess it's relatable, right? Like we all have inherited traits from our ancestors, so
Yeah, exactly.
everybody understands it in a way. Cool. Okay. Question 4: what is your top science fact, if you
Top
have
science
one?
fact.
Yeah.
Okay, there are over 200 species of bat in the world, and not one of them is blind.
Okay. All right.
It's just a thing we say, and it's just not true. Some bats have got surprisingly good eyesight. They do use
Mm.
echolocation, but the whole thing about bats being blind is it's just not true.
Just a common misconception. Another
Yeah.
common misconception. Okay. And we're actually a minute and a half still to go, so we're doing well.
Okay.
Last question: what is the most common misconception that you see that students have about science in secondary school when they arrive? So just something you keep seeing time and time again.
When they arrive, so we're talking about year 7 students, 11 years old, they think that science is experiments. They think that there's going to be color changes and fire and sparks and things like that. They're often a little bit disappointed to find out that that's actually only a very small fraction of science. I think that's the most common misconception most of them have.
Yeah, and I think that actually leads us really nicely into the starting point of the show, because I think there is that disparity between primary and secondary.
Mm,
With us in primary, we're really trying to gauge the children, make science fun, and it's still very sort of, primary fun focused, while
mm,
still trying to get the concepts in there, the science knowledge. So it seems like, and from other colleagues I've spoken to as well, once they hit year 7, 11
mm.
years old, all of a sudden there's this rush of topics and knowledge they're supposed to know,
Yeah.
or will need to know within that first year. And so, well, I guess my next kind of follow on question from that is: do you think that is the cause of maybe quite a lot of year 7 students going off science, not really thinking that they're not good at science anymore, or that they don't like science?
It could be. Yeah, they get there and realize that the expectations are very different. It could be simply that they think there is a bit about science, or they think that science is an experiment. That's what science is. And maybe don't have the appreciation for the fact that a huge amount of science is actually asking questions. It's data analysis. It's, lines of inquiry and that sort of thing.
Mm,
And it's challenging. I don't know that, I mean, obviously science is going to be more challenging to some students and less challenging to others, but that's true for every subject. Some students will find the same
yeah.
in geography and maths and English, etc. Everyone's sort of different. But when you picture coming in and doing practical experiments, most people will be able to do that. They'll be able to follow the instructions and do that. And so there's the expectation that that's what they'll be doing.
Mm.
And when it comes to it, and they may be faced with other challenges, actual academic challenges, it maybe just isn't what they had anticipated. They maybe thought that science was going to be the fun, easy subject, and perhaps it just comes as a bit of a surprise to some students, I think.
Explosions and elephant's toothpaste every lesson.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and that actually ties in really well with what I spoke about with Dr. Ann Forbes in my first show, where we discussed that the way that primary schools are approaching it is still not focused enough on inquiry, asking those questions, like you said. So I wonder if that's a real point that primary schools need to discuss to approach science in a more scientific way, teaching the scientific method, making sure that the children understand how to do an investigation?
Mm.
Or do you think that that would prepare them better for year 7?
Yeah, I do. The issue is if we look at a specific part of the curriculum in primary science, and so a teacher looks at that and they say, okay, today we're going to teach air resistance. What
Yeah.
should I do about that? Maybe they look online, they look on the Google Drive and see what was done last year, or they look on Twinkle and there's an experiment there about building a parachute or something like that. And then the instructions are there. This is how you'd build a parachute. This is how you would, these are the variables you would use. This is the vocabulary you could use. And that's, that kind of makes sense to look from that perspective. If I was to be teaching something that was well outside of my degree area, for example, I would expect some pretty clear-cut instructions. But while we do have to set some parameters for the students, there is possibly a bit of scope to instead either start with the question and then let the students figure it out. Say, how would you go about answering that question? And then, take the pressure off the teacher. They don't have to have this very specific practical activity that they've got in mind that they're ready to do. It's about letting the students figure out, how are you going to figure out the answer to that question? Or instead of that, give them the materials and say, what kind of question do you think you could answer based on the things that you've got? And part of it's just the nature of having a curriculum. We've got objectives and skills that we want to try and deliver, that we want the students to have by the end of that lesson or by the end of that unit. And so we find a way to deliver it and we deliver it. But maybe taking those constraints off the students a little bit is what develops that inquiry. And it's a bit of a double-edged sword, and it's a little bit of a utopian view of what education is, because actually, if we completely take the reins off and say, what sort of question would you answer, or what sort of experiment would you do, there's actually quite a risk that a lot of students wouldn't approach it scientifically and might not come up with a great experiment and might not gain what you want them to gain from that. So
Yeah.
I don't think it is something that I see in my teaching where I think I need to far more say, what do you think would be a good question here? Rather than saying, here's the experiment you're going to do to answer that question that I've just given you. It's something that I'm always aware of, that I'm always wanting to try and do more of, while also being mindful that I've got check boxes from a curriculum that I need to deliver.
Yes. Yeah. It's tough to balance that. And I think what primary school teachers are trying to do is get through that curriculum and teach the children all the concepts, the vocabulary, the ideas that they need to teach based on the curriculum, whichever one that may be. And then there's not enough freedom to just give the kids an open investigation. And I also think a second barrier to that is teacher confidence. So, not every primary school teacher has a science background. And so
Yeah.
that can be quite scary for some of them to just have this open investigation where the students have a lot of free reign. But I think that's definitely a conversation that we need to have about how can we sort of empower teachers to do that? How can school leaders empower teachers to do that?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think I really admire the way primary teachers do it, because they've just got to wear so many hats. I feel like when I go from biology to chemistry to physics, I feel like I'm changing quite a lot and I'm having to
Yeah.
adapt to all these different disciplines, but it's still science, isn't it? If I
Yeah.
had to teach maths and English and science and geography and history, and I had to have a decent degree of competence in all of that, and, you know, and I don't have a degree in anything other than one of those things, then yeah, I mean that's I think that's a bigger challenge that primary teachers face that secondary teachers don't necessarily have to deal with.
Absolutely. And I think that sort of brings us full circle to talking about the curriculum and how it could be redesigned, in an ideal world. So, we've talked about the skills
Yeah.
and how that could be balanced with the concept knowledge. And um, so in terms of curriculum itself, looking at that side of things, so, we've said that there are the gaps in the science skills and inquiry skills, but what gaps are you seeing in concept knowledge that maybe you wish primary teachers would focus a little bit more on?
Concept knowledge, I don't find that there are always huge gaps. I'm generally more impressed with the level of factual content that they seem to come with. So when I start teaching the topic on reproduction in flowering plants with year 7, all the kids, or most of the kids, seem to know all of the parts of the flower. And often when I'm teaching it to year 10 students, they don't have as good a knowledge. So clearly the kids have been taught it relatively recently, maybe in year 6, and they've come in with that
Yeah.
knowledge. And then a few years later, maybe it's sort of washed away a little bit. But the actual content that they seem to have, I think, is pretty strong. Absence that I think, and it's a fairly predictable one, is things like how they're using the apparatus. So, for example, if we give them a thermometer and say, what temperature do you see there? The particular thermometers that we've got in school, for example, they've got the numbers up one side, the tens up one side, and the ones up the other. So if it's 30 degrees, it'll be the 3, then there's the line where that moves up, and then there's the 0 on the other side of it. And so some of the students in a lesson the other day I said, what's the temperature? And they said 3. But if they've got that experience of reading a thermometer, familiarity with degrees Celsius, then that would obviously be the wrong answer. They'd look at it, oh, there's a 0, okay, the temperature is 30 degrees or whatever it might be. And similarly, things like, most of the kids have never seen a measuring cylinder before. They generally don't know how to use a mass balance. Some of them might be able to do that if they've done it at home on their kitchen scales, things like that. But there are some sort of key bits of apparatus that they seem very, very unfamiliar with. And that's kind of predictable because I don't know many primary schools that actually readily have those things on hand that are just going to make that part of their sort of weekly science tuition. But generally, I think that's the biggest gap, is that when we want to start doing these experiments and saying, right, first measure 100 mils of water, get 1 gram of salt. That is a full lesson teaching them to do those two things before you can then start getting them to do an experiment with those materials or with that setup.
Actually, it seems like what you're saying is that the students in primary have quite a good base, a good foundation in the knowledge. So it sounds like the primary school teachers are doing a really good job with building that knowledge base. But on the flip side, maybe because of teacher confidence, because of a lack of freedom in the curriculum, teachers are maybe not doing enough science inquiry and science skills. So measurements, using data loggers, thermometers, and that kind of thing. So I would like to ask if you have any experiments that teachers could use straight away in their classrooms to start to try and fill this gap.
Okay, I would say the best approach would be to take things that are quite readily available, anything that involves salt, sugar, water, that sort of thing. If the primary school in question doesn't have essential resources like measuring cylinders, mass balances, etc., then that's got to be a priority. Those are things that a school should invest in if they can. And then from there, simple things like how much, give the kids the question, how much salt can you dissolve in 10 milliliters of water? And then, let them figure out how to do that. Well, first of all, how do we measure 10 milliliters of water? If they're going to make a hypothesis, they've got to know, well, what does 10 milliliters look like? Is 10 milliliters a bucket full or is it a thimble full? Because they won't know until we show them, until they actually visualize it. And so much is going to start happening in their sort of experiential learning, their understanding of it. As soon as they pose that question, they're going to say, okay, well, let's see, what does 10 mil looks like? Okay, it's like that. Let's get this measuring cylinder. Oh, where's 10 mil? How do I fill that up? And then they've got to figure out how to do that. And then they say, okay, well, I think we can probably put a teaspoonful in. And they say, well, how big is a teaspoon? Do you mean like a the sort of teaspoon that we use to measure? Is that how we should measure things? Or, well, how can we measure it? And they say, oh, well, we usually use, kilograms or pounds or whatever they might say we use to measure. And you say, right, great. Well, in science, we would use grams and kilograms. How big is a gram? And as soon as you get that really simple concept, that really simple question, suddenly loads and loads of other little questions start coming about. And it might seem really trivial. It might seem like not a very exciting lesson, but the amount of engagement that can be drawn from students from something as simple as that So I would say start with things that, they don't have to be concepts that are well outside of the comfort zone of the teacher. I could describe experiments relating to, photosynthesis. I could describe experiments about, doing ecological field sampling and things like that. But that's only, I'm really comfortable with that because it's all part of my experience and my degree and that sort of thing. So stick with things that stick with things that are familiar, and that's not just for the teacher's benefit, that's for the student's benefit as well. Stick with things that they know, so they're not having to stretch their thinking too far, because they're going to have to stretch their thinking quite far
Mm.
for the science. And so I think that would be where I would start, is take the most basic everyday items and start thinking, how can we start asking some questions around those?
That's really useful. And I think that that's something that a lot of primary teachers would love to hear. And I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges is we've got so much to cover, so much to do.
Yeah.
And science is often only given, a single or a double lesson a week, that trying to find the time to do those investigations is difficult. So
All I would say is that it's not necessarily about finding the experiment. It would just be about the teacher themselves thinking, oh, well, what would be a good question? What's something that I see every day, like things that I see in the kitchen? We all see chemical reactions taking place in the kitchen, for example, things that are quite easy for us to picture, to communicate with the kids. And I would say take it from there. Do whatever interests you, do whatever you're more comfortable with, do whatever the kids are more interested in. In primary school, it might relate to a different lesson. If there's work in geography and you're studying oceans and salt water versus fresh water, well, then that would be the perfect segue into something about salt water and salt dissolving or something like that. It could easily be a sort of horizontal link with something else in the curriculum. But I would say I would discourage someone from looking too much for an experiment that's out there, and just sort of go with your gut, go with what would make for a good experiment. Try it out
yeah,
yourself, make sure you can actually get some sort of a result. But other than that, just go with it. Do what seems the most interesting.
yeah. And you made a good point as well about making those horizontal links. So it doesn't necessarily need to be in a science lesson. It could be part of a maths investigation about grams and kilograms, for example, and milliliters, or it could be in a topic or geography history class as well. So that's really good advice. Thank you for that.
Well, that's a good connection as well. If you're doing something on maths, there are often opportunities to take whatever you're doing in maths and say, well, could we collect some data that would allow us to practice that mathematical skill? So you say, well, we're gonna put a bunch of seeds in some soil. We're gonna put some of them out in the daylight and some of them in a cupboard, and we're gonna see how many of them testing the idea. Do plants need sunlight to germinate or not? And you get three groups of kids do it, and then you've got to get an average. And that's a really difficult skill for some primary school students. A lot of them struggle with calculating averages. I don't know the primary curriculum well in maths, but it seems like it's relatively late in primary school that's taught. And so when that does come up, doing some sort of real world application where you say, right, well, we're gonna test this, we're gonna get three sets of data, let's calculate an average on our data. Now you've posed a question, or the kids have posed a question. Now you've got the data. Now you're doing analysis. So there's a whole load of scientific inquiry and scientific skills going on there, which are also putting the math skills into practice. And something like how many seeds will germinate, again, that's a nice easy one that anyone could think up. You can get the seeds from a little bag at the supermarket, get little green beans or
Yeah.
something like that. And it doesn't take a lot of forward planning. You don't need a degree in biology to plant seeds. And so I think that's an opportunity to put a lot of those pieces of the puzzle into place, I think.
Nice. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's about finding those clever little links and just going for it, being confident enough and going for it. So we've covered the basics and the fact that primary schools need to maybe cover those basic science skills a bit more. But then on the flip side, I also wanted to ask about another sort of relevant hot topic, as it were, which was how quickly science is evolving at the moment, especially science and tech as well. So with AI, industry technology, it's all advancing so fast. Is that something that you're considering in secondary science at the school? Is that even a part of the curriculum yet?
The nature of changing science and preparing our students to always be ready for that changing world, no, that's not part of the curriculum. But I would suggest that assuming we adequately teach the scientific method, that means that ultimately our students will be equipped to apply it to whatever else comes up in the future.
Mm.
We've got to be realistic that, if I'm teaching a lesson on osmosis, how many of the students in my class are going to go on into a career that relies on them knowing about osmosis? The chances are marginal if we're being realistic. They're learning an awful lot of skills from that, I think, but the actual experiment itself, we've got to be realistic that might not carry forward into their futures.
Yeah.
But if we are delivering this in a way that teaches them scientific inquiry, teaches them the scientific method, then if they are going to go into the world of science of some type in the future, they should logically be equipped to start asking new and unique questions, because that's what scientists do. Practicing scientists out there in academia, they're not doing experiments that have been done before. They're trying to ask new questions. They're trying to answer new questions and find new information. And they can't do that unless they are using the scientific method adequately. So as long as we are teaching that,
Yeah.
I think that's the best we can do for the kids.
Yeah, that's true. As long as we build that strong foundation in primary and then a bit more advanced into secondary, keep them understanding that science, although there's all these different areas of science, that actually on the bottom level, it is about having those basic skills which you can then apply to any area. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very good point, actually. Thank you. All right. So amazing. We've discussed quite a lot in a very short amount of time today, relatively. Um, it's really been invaluable to dive into these key points with you. But do you think that there's anything crucial in terms of bridging a gap between primary and secondary education in science that you think we haven't covered yet today?
It's really hard to say there is a crucial thing because, I could talk about one primary school and that would be a very different
Yeah.
description to how another primary school compares them. So the reality is, anything I say, oh, it would be great if primary school teachers are doing more of such and such. There'll be loads of primary school teachers who watch this podcast and say, oh, but I do that all the time. And so
Yeah.
giving really specifics are difficult. The only thing that I think all students, and I'm talking about my students in my classes as well, need to always be reminded of and have reinforced is the nature of what science is. And science to me is something that, whether we know it or not, we are using absolutely every day. We're probably using it 100 times a day. When I introduce the scientific method, my go-to is to always take something that's in no way related to a science lesson or the science curriculum. My first up example is you are getting ready to go out. You want to know, is it raining outside? Because you want to know if you should put a rainproof jacket on or take an umbrella or something. And you could just decide for yourself, yeah, it's probably raining, I'll take an umbrella. And then you take your umbrella and you go out, and maybe it's raining or maybe it's not. But that was just taking a random guess. Whereas in actual fact, what you would do, what any sensible person would do, is they would say, okay, maybe it's raining, maybe I need an umbrella. Hey, let me quickly look out the window. Oh, yeah, it's raining, I can see rain. Then you take your umbrella. So what you've done is you've come up with a question, you've then run an experiment. The experiment is to look out the window. It's a very simple experiment, but you've done the
Yeah.
experiment. You've collected the data. The data is, I see rain. Your conclusion, it's raining outside. And when you look at it in that context, you realize actually almost every decision you make will be based on the scientific method in some way. For you to make a decision or to come to a conclusion without any evidence at all, well, that's just guesswork, and it's in most circumstances
Yeah.
quite a bad idea. And so I like to think that if we, primary and secondary teachers, constantly reinforce that idea that the scientific method is not something for a science lab, it is something that we should all be using every day, and we probably are using every day, then it suddenly all starts to become a little bit more clear. Then when you start applying it to more advanced scientific concepts, it falls into place. You think, oh, right, well, I would assume that this is true. But unless I actually do the experiment, unless I collect the data, I might be wrong. That thing that I think is common sense might not be true when I actually investigate it. Because ultimately that is at the core of science. So I think if we do that, if we can achieve that, if
Yeah.
we can manage that, then we can sort of turn them into scientists.
Yeah, I really like that analogy there. And I think that's something that all primary teachers could do tomorrow, just with simple observations about, if it's lunchtime, how do we check? Well, we look at the clock and so on,
Exactly.
just making those simple observations. Could put it on a poster.
Exactly.
It'd be really nice. Yeah, thank you for that. So before we go, I also just wanted to ask you more about your online resource. So it's called Science Source.
Right.
So what is kind of your vision in general for Science Source? Because it's blown up into quite a popular YouTube channel. And also, do you have any plans for expanding it or doing more videos down the line?
Okay, so the vision, I don't know, it started because I always liked the idea that students could access the learning themselves, but be able to press pause and rewind, and if they didn't quite pick up on that word that you said, they could go back over it, and obviously now they can turn the captions on and all that kind of thing. And it's just, to me, that way of giving students that little bit of extra access to the learning. My experiences in school, I really struggled to pay attention. I had some lessons where the content was really interesting, the teacher was interesting, but for them to stand up there and give a presentation, and I had to sit and listen for 10, 15, 20 minutes, I really struggled with that. And I think just providing that resource where they can do it, they can look over it. I can say, right, what we've done is on this video, go home and do the homework task, but you've got this to help you review it. You've got this to look over it. Or in some cases, even saying, next lesson we're learning about such and such. There's a video on it. Watch the video before you come to class. Then we'll dive straight into the practical work or into exploring it or something like that. So just having that little something is how it started. It all started with me intending to share it just with my students. I put one video on YouTube. I didn't make a conscious decision to be a YouTuber. That wasn't the plan. It was just YouTube was free. I could put it on there, and I didn't have to pay server costs or anything like that. So I put it out there. I made a video which I introduced with, if I remember right, the sentence was, "This is a quick presentation to describe the process of osmosis and diffusion." It wasn't quick. It went on for 12 or 15 minutes, which is really long, I think, for a quick explainer for kids. But I did it, and then I set my students a homework task on that video the next day, and then I forgot about it. And then maybe 3 months later, I came back to making another video, and I thought, where shall I put this video? How will I share it? Yeah, maybe I'll do it on YouTube. Went on youtube.com. Wait, I'm signed in. What's this? Wait, have I? Yeah, I already uploaded a video a while back. Yeah. And then I looked and it had somewhere close to 10,000 views. And I was like, this must be a
Whoa.
mistake. This must be a mistake. I think at the time when I first looked, maybe it was 7,000, but that was a
Yeah.
massive number to me.
Yeah.
And then obviously I started following it over the next sort of few weeks. And within another month, it was at 10,000 views or something. And then I was like, wow, people were commenting and things. I was like, people are actually watching my videos. And I think that just gave me that little bit of motivation, and it just went from there. Just went on and on from there.
Really nice. Yeah. And I think a lot of that is because, as well as secondary school teachers, a lot of upper primary school teachers use these kinds of resources, these kinds of videos for pre-teaching, for lesson starters, or helping the kids to do their own research in sort of a safer way or a more focused way than
Yeah,
just go and search on Google. So
yeah.
I think that kind of resource is really valuable. And of course, now you've made how many videos have you made now?
Well, I don't know. It must be. It's either maybe it's approaching 100, maybe it's just over 100, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean covering almost anything and everything you can think of in secondary science. But do you think that you'll continue to make videos, or do you think you've covered it now?
No, I definitely don't think I've covered it. I've got a lot more that I'd like to do. The reality is actually just finding the time.
Yeah.
I'm always having this debate with myself whether I should try and do more videos a little bit more quickly. I just, put the presentation together, do the voiceover and publish it. Whereas in practice, what I actually do is I write a script and then I make all of the visuals and then I do the voiceover, then I edit all of the visuals to fit perfectly in place. And so one 3-minute video, it comes together as quite neat and succinct
Mm,
because I've spent 10 or 15 hours, getting
yes.
it just right and making it neat and concise and making sure that that word flies across the screen at exactly the moment it comes out of my mouth and that sort of thing. So yes, I'd love to do more, but the time commitment means it
Mm.
limits how rapidly I can put them out there.
Yeah, that's definitely a consideration there. Well, it really has been such a pleasure chatting with you today, Alex. Honestly, thank you very, very much for joining us and sharing your wisdom with us all.
It's been great to chat with you. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hopefully, we can welcome you back for another chat one day in the future.
That sounds cool. Thanks, Tim.
Brilliant. Nice one.
Cheers.
Thank you. Okay. So, in conclusion, there seems to be a really, really clear gap across the board here with primary education and science from both the first and now the second episode of this podcast. And that's that whilst in primary schools, we seem to be covering the science concepts really, really well. It looks like we need to burrow a little bit deeper into what science really is, which is just like with Alex's analogy about the rainy day. It's just finding answers to questions. And then subsequently, we need to then find ways of teaching how to do that with those basic science skills like making measurements, logging data, presenting data, and then lay that really strong foundation with those hard skills for the children as they move up to secondary science education. So, to all you wonderful listeners out there, thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast with Alex. Please do remember that all your feedback and support has really meant a lot since I started the show last month. So, one thing I'd really love to hear more of is your comments, your feedback on today's show, on the first episode with Dr. Ann Forbes, and um, what your thoughts are on the topics that we've discussed as well. So tell us what you liked. Tell us what you want to hear more about on next month's episode. Most of all, thank you very much for listening. So wherever you are in the world, everybody, I wish you a fantastic day. Chat soon and bye for now from the Primary Science Podcast. Bye-bye.